You know, it's kind of mind-blowing when you really stop and think about how much of our reality feels, well, deliberately constructed.
Hmm.
Like the financial system or the way information flows, these aren't just random, are they? They feel engineered, like someone's actually, pulling the levers.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely makes you wonder about who's at the controls or if there are controls.
Right.
And that's exactly the fascinating ground we're covering today. We got this really compelling set of materials actually from one of you listening.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, a deep stack. It's got everything from like historical analyses of financial power, deep dives into propaganda mechanics, even some surprisingly revealing government docs.
Revealing is right. We're
Yeah.
talking bits from big books like All the President's Bankers, that old classic propaganda, plus articles, Engineering Reality, Part 3, The Corporate Veil.
Yeah, and academic papers, news bits, even things like the Congressional Globe and that specific 1871 Act of Congress.
It's a real mix. So what's the mission here? Just connect the dots.
Pretty much. The idea is to really dig in, see how these bits, which seem separate maybe, actually link up. We're trying to spot, hidden connections, maybe fundamental shifts in how power works.
In the U.S. or bigger?
Well, America primarily, but possibly globally too. We'll trace some historical shifts in governance, the rise of corporate influence, how control has morphed from like physical force to psychological stuff, and now digital.
And maybe even where the system's showing cracks.
Exactly. We'll touch on that too, where there might be some pushback. So yeah, definitely some food for thought coming up.
Okay, let's get into it. You mentioned that 1871 Act of Congress.
hmm
Seems kind of specific, maybe dry, but you're saying it could be a big deal, a pivot point.
It really could be, yeah.
Yeah.
It might sound like just bureaucratic housekeeping, but this act basically reorganized how Washington, D.C. was run.
So
It set up what's called a municipal corporation to manage the District of Columbia. And if you dig into the wording, like in the Congressional Globe, it calls D.C. a body corporate for municipal purposes.
body courting.
Yeah, and it gives it the power to contract and be contracted with, sue and be sued. Now, that's standard language for, a business, a commercial entity.
Not typically how you describe the heart of a national government, though.
Exactly. It's a bit unusual, right? Setting up the nation's capital itself like a company.
So why? What was going on there?
Well, the timing is interesting. It's right after the Civil War. The U.S. was under considerable financial strain,
Makes sense.
and international finance was shifting too. Some analyses, like in that Corporate Veil article, suggest this reorganization might have been tied to those financial issues, those vulnerabilities.
So it wasn't just about running the city better, maybe. It could have been about finance, debt.
That's one interpretation, certainly, and it's worth noting the Supreme Court later in 1889, Metropolitan Railroad Kofigo District of Columbia, they explicitly called D.C. a municipal corporation, so the status stuck. So the takeaway isn't just, oh, D.C. got reorganized, it's maybe the start of viewing the seat of government itself through a kind of commercial lens, like it's a business right from the get-go.
Right. Okay, so DC gets this corporate structure, then we jump forward, what, a few decades? Early 20th century, Woodrow Wilson comes along talking about an administrative state. How does that fit in?
It's a fascinating link, potentially. Wilson's idea, developing around, say, 1913 to 1933, was really about management by expertise, instead of what he called government by consent. The idea was you'd have unelected experts making the key decisions because they supposedly knew best. More efficient, more effective.
Efficiency over direct democracy, maybe.
Sort of. Now think about that in light of D.C. being set up as a corporation. Wilson's model sounds a lot like how a corporation is run, doesn't it?
Yeah, management makes the calls, not necessarily the shareholders directly, or in this case, the citizens.
Exactly. So you see this potential pattern. First, the capital gets a corporate framework. Then the style of governing starts to mimic corporate management. Power shifting away from elected folks to, well, appointed administrators.
It feels like applying a business hierarchy to governing the country.
hmm
And this happens after DC is already incorporated. That's consistent.
It is a consistent theme, yeah. And what's also interesting is how the courts seem to kind of go along with this, interpreting the government's role in more commercial terms.
Like how?
Well, there's a 1945 Supreme Court case, Hooven and Allison Copedy v. Evatt. The court actually distinguished between the United States as a sovereign entity and a federal corporation.
Wow, they actually use that term, federal corporation.
They did. And then, just 2 years earlier, 1943, Clearfield Trust Company, United States, The court flat out said, the United States does business on business terms.
Okay, that's pretty blunt. Doing business on business terms.
Right. So these rulings seem to legally acknowledge the federal government acting, at least sometimes, like a commercial player. It blurs those lines between being a sovereign power and acting like a corporation.
Okay, so let's recap briefly. We've got the Capital City Incorporated, a move towards expert administration like corporate management, and courts saying the U.S. does business on business terms. And smack in the middle of that period, 1913, boom, the Federal Reserve. How crucial is that piece?
Oh, it's absolutely central. Central to this whole story. Officially, right? The Fed was created to make the financial system more stable, more flexible. That was the pitch.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, if you look back at the debates, the congressional record from that time, there were huge concerns being raised. People worried that private banking interests were basically going to hijack the nation's money supply.
Control the money, control, a lot.
Pretty much. Control over creating money gives you immense leverage over the whole economy, doesn't it?
And the argument from some of these sources is that the Fed effectively shifted that control away from the government itself.
Towards private banks, yeah. That's the argument you see in writers like Murray Rothbard. His book, The Case Against the Fed, basically says it created a setup for private banks to pull the strings on monetary policy.
And is there evidence that points that way? Like, what happened after?
Well, one thing often pointed out is the massive increase in national debt after the Fed came into being. And then there's the story Anthony Sutton tells in the Federal Reserve Conspiracy about that secret meeting on Jekyll Island.
Ah, yes, the Jekyll Island story.
Yeah.
Where powerful bankers basically designed the system in secret.
Allegedly, yes. And Frank Vanderlip, who was actually there, he later admitted in a Saturday Evening Post article, I think it was 1935, he said their trip was, and this is a quote, as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator.
Furtive as any conspirator.
Wow.
He actually said that.
He did. And he called it the occasion of the actual conception of what became the Fed. When someone involved uses language like that, well, it makes you question the official story, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Okay, so the Fed's established under these, let's say, questionable circumstances. Then later, we move off the gold standard entirely. Fiat currency. How does that ratchet things up?
Moving to fiat currency money not backed by gold or anything physical was another huge step. It fundamentally changed what money is.
How so?
Well, as Martin Wolf observed, most money now isn't even physical cash. It's just digital entries in bank computers. Tiny fraction is notes and coins.
Right. Created by banks when they make loans, essentially.
Exactly, which gives immense power to the institutions controlling those digital ledgers. And Stephen Zarlenga pointed out this kind of paradox. With fiat money, you're basically using debt notes to pay off debt. It's a system that requires constant credit creation to keep going.
Like a treadmill, as you said. It has to keep spinning faster.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Its value comes purely from the government saying it has value and people trusting that. It gives central banks way more control, but removes that physical tether, that constraint.
Okay. So parallel to these big shifts in government structure and finance, the sources also talk about changes in the legal framework itself. What's the gist there?
This is where it gets really complex and, frankly, a bit controversial. There seems to be a drift away from traditional common law based on precedent and custom towards principles you find more in admiralty or commercial law.
Admiralty, like maritime law. How does that apply?
Well, the argument is that commercial law principles are becoming more dominant. And tied into this is a distinction between you as a living person, natural personhood, and your legal personhood.
Like a corporation being a legal person.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court touched on this distinction in Hale v. Henkel. Now, this leads into something called the straw man theory.
Okay, I've heard that term. What is it exactly?
And we should probably say up front, this is not something mainstream courts accept, right? They tend to view it as baseless. Absolutely critical point. Mainstream legal thinking and courts dismiss the straw man arguments as frivolous, even a scam sometimes. But the theory itself posits that when you're born, through things like birth certificates and registration, a separate legal entity, the straw man, is created.
Like a legal fiction. An entity in all caps on documents, maybe.
That's often part of the claim, yeah. Think of it like your name on an envelope, it represents you, but it's not you. The theory suggests this legal entity operates under commercial law, while your physical self is under natural or common law. Again, this is the theory, not established legal fact.
And this theory tries to connect back to older legal ideas.
It often points to things like the Cestui Que Vie Act from 1666 in England. That act dealt with property rights when people were, say, lost at sea and presumed dead for legal purposes, separating their physical existence from their legal status regarding property.
Okay, so it's drawing parallels from old laws about property and status.
Right. And someone like Edwin Vieira Jr. raises the idea, maybe more metaphorically, that citizens could end up being treated almost like assets on the government's books within this kind of framework.
So the provocative question arising from this, even if the specific strawman theory is rejected, is, are we somehow operating in two legal realms simultaneously? Our physical selves under one set of principles, and our legal identities, our paperwork selves, under another, more commercial system.
That's the deeper, more philosophical question it raises, yeah. Are we sort of bifurcated legally? It's a really challenging idea to grapple with.
Definitely. Okay, now let's shift focus slightly to those three specific cities that often come up in these kinds of discussions: London, Vatican City, and Washington, D.C. The sources suggest they're interconnected in significant ways.
Yes, this is where you start seeing potential overlaps and alliances more clearly. If you look historically, there are definite financial and diplomatic ties.
Like what specifically?
Well, for instance, we know the Rothschild banking family provided loans to the Holy See, the Vatican, way back in 1832.
Okay, a financial link.
Then, later that century, 1875, the British government bought a huge stake in the Suez Canal. That deal was financed by the Rothschilds again, linking London's imperial interests with that same financial power.
London and the Vatican linked through finance, at least historically. What about D.C.?
Diplomatically, look at 1939, right on the cusp of World War II. President Roosevelt appointed Myron C. Taylor as his personal representative to the Vatican. That suggests high-level coordination, or at least communication.
Just before the war breaks out. Interesting timing.
Very. And there are also documented secret communications between Pope Pius XII and Hitler around the same time. Then, after the war, you see coordinated approaches to reconstruction involving both Washington and the Vatican.
So it's not just one-off things, but a pattern. Finance, diplomacy, strategy, connecting these three centers.
It appears that way, yes. A web of connections over time.
And what about the obelisks? That detail seems almost out there.
Yeah.
Egyptian obelisks prominently displayed in all three cities. Coincidence, architectural trend, or something else.
It is a curious detail, isn't it? Joshua Stallman points it out. London, Rome, near the Vatican, and D.C. all have these ancient Egyptian monuments.
Okay.
Now, the standard explanation is, oh, it was the neoclassical style, the Egyptian revival was fashionable, and historians like James Stevens Curl document that trend.
Makes sense, architecturally.
But Curl also notes this style became really popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, exactly when modern banking and centralized states were really taking shape. So given the other financial and political links we just discussed,
You start to wonder if it's just fashion. Could there be some deeper symbolism representing some kind of shared power or ancient knowledge connection? Maybe.
that's the question it inevitably raises, right? Especially when you see the same unusual symbol in these specific powerful locations. Is it just aesthetics or something more? It certainly makes you pause and think.
It really does. Okay, this feels like a good transition point. We've talked about structures of power, corporate, financial, legal. Now, how is consent managed within these structures? How is public opinion shaped? This sounds like getting into mind war territory.
Exactly. Michael Aquino's work, Mind War, although controversial itself, offers a lens. He talks about things like false flag operations to manipulate opinion, or just relentless drum beating, repeating a message over and over until people accept it.
And how does that play out today?
Well, think about media ownership. It's incredibly concentrated. Just 6 huge corporations control something like 90% of the media we consume.
6 companies. That's
Right.
not a lot of diversity of ownership.
Not at all. And this concentration allows for what Stallman calls a fiat news system. It kind of mirrors fiat currency.
So, declare, repeat, enforce.
You got it. Declare a narrative, repeat it endlessly across all channels, and then enforce it by marginalizing or censoring dissenting views.
And you mentioned earlier, didn't you, that the same big investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard are major shareholders in both these media giants and the big banks?
That's often pointed out, yes. Which raises obvious questions about potential coordination or at least shared interests in the information we get.
It seems like a potential conflict of interest, at the very least.
You could certainly argue that. Then you add in the way entertainment and propaganda can merge. Influencers, celebrities pushing messages, sometimes subtly, sometimes not.
Product placement for ideas, almost.
Kind of. And then layer on top the algorithms. Digital platforms create these personalized reality bubbles. They feed you content that reinforces what they think you believe or what they want you to believe. It gets harder and harder to stumble across genuinely different perspectives.
So it's not just controlling the source, but controlling the delivery right to your screen,
Yeah.
tailored just for you. It sounds incredibly effective.
It's hyper-personalized persuasion, yeah. And while the tech is new, the basic idea isn't.
You mean like the Prussian education model?
Exactly. That model, which heavily influenced American schooling in the 19th century, wasn't primarily about critical thinking. It was designed to create obedient citizens, people who'd accept information from authority without too much questioning.
Follow the rules, trust the experts.
Right. That Brownstone Institute article, How the Information Factory Evolved, makes the case that the goal was molding mass consciousness efficiently. It's a three-layer cake, basically.
Okay.
First, capture the institutions that create knowledge universities, think tanks. Second, capture the ones that legitimize it, mainstream media, scientific journals. Third, capture the ones that disseminate it, schools. And now, social media.
Create, legitimize, disseminate.
And technology, especially algorithms, has just turbocharged that third layer. They can even identify and preemptively counter dissent before it spreads too widely.
That's chilling. And the COVID-19 pandemic is often brought up as a case study of this in action, isn't it?
It is. Many analyses point to how a specific narrative about the virus, the lockdowns, the treatments was heavily amplified, while other scientific viewpoints or questions about the response were often suppressed or labeled misinformation.
Regardless of the actual merits, the process looked like that declare, repeat, enforce model.
That's the argument. It felt to many like a modern version of what happened, say, with Rockefeller influence shaping the medical field a century ago, defining what was acceptable knowledge and marginalizing alternatives. But now, it happens much faster and on a global scale.
But you said earlier, these systems aren't foolproof. People
Yeah.
are pushing back. We're seeing cracks.
Definitely. There are clear signs that people are getting wary. Think about the consumer reactions we saw in 2023, Bud Light,
Mhm.
Target. Their social messaging campaigns backfired pretty spectacularly.
People voted with their wallets.
They did, big time. And even powerful firms like BlackRock pushing ESG investing, they faced pushback, seen money flow out, had to adjust their approach. It shows that even huge institutions aren't immune to public sentiment. While celebrity endorsements seem less potent than they used to be, people are more skeptical. And you see those viral videos comparing news anchors reading the exact same script.
Oh yeah, those are damning.
They really undermine trust in legacy media. Plus, more people are questioning fact-checking organizations, especially when they find out who funds them, often the very entities whose narratives they're checking.
So the veneer of objectivity is wearing thin for some.
For a growing number, it seems so. There's a rising demand for just authenticity, transparency. People are actively seeking out independent journalists, leaving mainstream social media that feels manipulative.
And maybe focusing more locally, building real-world communities.
That too. And you see the rise of alternative platforms, ones that at least claim to prioritize free speech. Even if they're still centralized, they offer an alternative. The real game changer, potentially, is truly decentralized networks, no central point of control to censor or manipulate.
So it comes down to individual choices then. What we choose to consume, where we choose to engage.
Exactly. As Stallman puts it, it's a choice we make every day. Do you passively accept the feed, the algorithm suggestions, or do you actively seek out different views, make conscious choices about your information diet?
Because these systems, however complex, are ultimately human creations.
Precisely. They were built, and anything built can potentially be understood, challenged, changed, or even dismantled. It starts with recognition, awareness, then comes creativity, genuine connection, and maybe reclaiming a sense of individual sovereignty over our own minds.
Wow. Okay, so pulling it all together from this deep dive, we've journeyed through the potential corporate structuring of government, the massive shifts in finance with the Fed and fiat money, these complex legal ideas about personhood, the interconnectedness of power centers like London, D.C., the Vatican, and finally, these incredibly sophisticated mechanisms for shaping belief and controlling narratives.
Yeah, it paints a picture, doesn't it? A picture where, as you said at the start, reality can feel quite engineered,
Yeah,
deliberately constructed.
it really does.
And that leaves a big question hanging there for everyone listening. What does all this mean for you? For your idea of what it means to be a sovereign individual, a citizen? How do you navigate this information landscape? What does being well-informed even look like today?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. So we hope this exploration spurs further thought. Dig into the sources yourselves, question the patterns, see how they might apply to what's happening now.
Keep questioning, keep seeking different perspectives, keep engaging. This isn't about having all the answers, but about staying curious and thinking critically. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.